sharing here in regards to book sales. So that's where I'm going to start, in fact, with a little book sales update. Print unit sales are up, in fact, by almost 1% versus last year. Now, this accounts for retail sales. It doesn't account for sales that might be happening through libraries or through other sectors that aren't stores. But it's actually a really good picture because, year after year after year, when you look at print sales growth, it tends to be flat. Book publishing is a very mature industry. You don't see a lot of growth year to year. We feel lucky if there is a small percentage of growth. So far this year, things have been performing really well. And this is from the folks at NPD BookScan, which calculate sales at the point of purchase. This includes both bricks and mortar stores as well as online stores like Amazon. Now, there is some bad news. Those bricks and mortar stores have seen a sales decline. So right now we have figures for March and April where we probably had most stores in lockdown of some kind where they couldn't sell in person, although they could, of course, do things like curbside pickup or ship or delivery. So bookstore sales did see a 33% decline in March, double that in April. And those figures are from the US Census Bureau. Now, again, this is going to be like good news, bad news, good news, bad news, kind of cycling through that throughout this presentation. The good news for those bricks and mortar stores was the serendipitous launch of an online retailer known as Bookshop, which you may have heard of if you are a fan of bookstores. So Bookshop was launched in January 2020, before anyone really realized what was happening as far as the pandemic. It's the brainchild of Andy Hunter in New York City, who oversees a publishing company and a range of other digital publishing initiatives. And his goal is to peel away basically 1% of Amazon book sales. And there we go. And he didn't expect to achieve that 1% goal probably for 3 years, but he was able to achieve it in roughly 3 to 4 months on account of changing purchasing behavior and the clarion call to support independent bookstores. Because the business model for Bookshop, which is strictly an online retailer, is to use Ingram, which is the biggest book wholesaler and distributor in the US, to use Ingram to sell books online in a very seamless way, and then to donate a big portion of those proceeds right back into independent booksellers. So independent booksellers don't have to have an online store set up on their own independently. They can still benefit from sales through Bookshop, whether or not they have that storefront, by simply becoming a partner. Now, meanwhile, that's not to say that Amazon has been devastated by Bookshop, although, Andy Hunter did achieve his 1%. Amazon still accounts, by most estimates, for 70% of all online book sales, which of course is enormous, and Amazon has been doing very well during the pandemic with all sorts of goods, including books. Now, to look at ebook sales is also interesting because you might expect during a lockdown where it's harder to go out and buy physical products, people might be leaning towards ebooks and digital materials. And that is true, although it depends on where you look just how fast the digital adoption has gone. So for traditional publishers, they have seen an uptick in ebook sales. They saw a nice growth in April when they wouldn't normally expect to see any growth in the spring, 11%. We've seen more growth in the ebook distributors on the self-publishing side, where they have seen somewhere between 25 and 50% growth in April and May. And by ebook distributors, I'm thinking about companies like Smashwords, Drafted Digital, Publish Drive, and so on. What those ebook distributors have also been able to show is where the sales are happening, and they're seeing a lot more sales in international markets, so like in Europe, and elsewhere where maybe ebook adoption was really slow, where ebooks haven't been as popular as they are in the US and the UK. They've also seen subscription services way up. So these are services like Scribd and Storytel. And so we might extrapolate from that, that Kindle Unlimited in the US is probably also doing quite well. These are the all you can read or all you can listen ebook and audiobook services. And then libraries, of course, have seen huge in the adoption of digital resources. So if you look at Hoopla and Overdrive, those are some of the distributors for ebooks to libraries that have seen growth. I see a question from Cliff. He's saying, because Bookshop only uses Ingram, books, other distributors like small press distribution aren't available, and will they address that gap? It's really hard to say what might happen there. Certainly Bookshop has had growing pains, you might say, because of they just weren't expecting to grow this fast. And so now they are, I don't want to say they're scrambling because that would make them sound disorganized, but they're getting a lot of interest and a lot of requests from places that they might not otherwise have received. So I do know that they're already planning to expand into the UK through a partnership with, I believe, Gardner's, so because Ingram isn't as active in the UK. So I would expect that they're looking at all possible options for making as many books as available. And small press distribution is an offshoot of CLMP, which is the Council of Literary Magazines and Presses. And I would expect there to be a really strong relationship between them and possibly Bookshop, because they're part of the same literary community. So I would be optimistic, but I haven't heard anything specific. Now, something else that's really helping the sales for big publishers and small publishers alike is the social unrest, Black Lives Matter, all of these issues currently in the news. This is benefiting Black authors, Black bookstores in particular. Back in June, we saw that roughly half of the anti-racist books on the New York Times bestseller lists were out of stock. And there was a blackout bestseller list campaign that was launched by one of the big 5 publishing imprints, Amistad. And they were very successful with this campaign. It's so successful that some Black bookstores got so many orders that it was hard for them to keep up. One store in particular got 20,000 orders. So this is just a quick look here of some of the titles that were performing really well in June. Some of these titles are still outperforming, like How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility in particular. As far as the other categories that are doing quite well so far this year, perhaps not surprising, nonfiction for younger readers has just really outperformed as kids are home. Parents need to help facilitate education, do more schooling. So we're seeing increased sales of education and reference books, also games and activities. And the only fiction category to show growth right now for young readers is science fiction and fantasy. So a lot of the attention is on those nonfiction resources. One of the downsides of this is that these types of books often sell for lower price points. So we're seeing that even though book sales are up, some of the dollars involved in publishing are down because they're in this lower priced area. For adults, cookbooks have outperformed as we all have to eat in more, or we're cooking more, engaging in things like baking or in comfort foods. Also, juices and smoothies are doing well. On the audiobook side, this has often been the place that publishers have relied on for facilitating growth, keeping both their top line and their bottom line looking good. Especially given that ebook sales have been on the decline for the big traditional publishers. So unfortunately, we did see a little bit of a growth dip during the early stages of the pandemic as people stopped commuting, and that put a little dent in sales. But we're starting to see the trend lines go back to where they were prior to the pandemic. So it seems that people are finding new routines and new ways to engage in audiobook listening, especially we're seeing that families are gathering together around the Alexa or whatever device that they're using to listen to stories together. There was a report just put out by the Audio Book Publishers Association, the APA, looking at growth from 2015 to 2019, and there has been a slowdown in growth. So it feels like audiobook publishing has been the golden goose now for about 5 or 6 years. It can't be that forever, so it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over the next 5 years, as that easy growth starts to become a little more challenging to sustain. Something that also happened this year because of the pandemic is that publishers started delaying some of their titles. So for those books that really relied on bookstore merchandising or placement or media attention, which is really hard to get right now, they thought, well, better to save these titles' release dates for July, August, and September, avoiding the election months, which will be very difficult to get media attention for as well. And now we have this, crowding that's happening just as I speak, where booksellers and publishers alike are, it's a traffic jam of titles, and it's really hard to compete. So it's like going from the frying pan into the fire with what's happened here. Some publishers decided to postpone all the way into next year. Whether that will prove to be a smarter decision, who can say? But certainly there's a lot of shuffling around that's happening. One question that's on the mind of many writers and clients that I speak with, since I help people with query letters and synopses and book proposals, people are wondering if they should submit right now. This is a really hard question to answer because every publisher and agent is going to be affected differently by this. Even if they're in New York, even if they work from home, everyone has a different situation, different family needs, different, just different ways of dealing. So generally, my advice is proceed as much as you can, business as usual. I don't think there's any guarantee things will improve. Things could get worse. I'm not a pessimist at heart, but there could be layoffs. There could be people deciding they don't want to agent anymore. Like, there are all sorts of questions and hardships that may yet still be to come. So holding off doesn't necessarily put you in a better position. As far as what agents are looking for, if you take a look at the hashtag manuscript wish list, MSWL, this is something agents use on Twitter to talk about what they'd like to see come across their desk. You'll see a great focus on those who are underrepresented in publishing. This includes neuroatypical protagonists, characters with disabilities, queer voices, as well as any Black, Indigenous, or person of color. Authors like that are encouraged right now, especially big publishers are even dropping their agent requirement where you have to have your materials submitted by an agent for Black authors or people of color to encourage those submissions. There's also a really strong focus right now, and probably there will be for forever or many years to come, on own voices. This is the movement that's encouraging publishers and everyone in the publishing ecosystem to prioritize books by marginalized authors that are about those marginalized communities that they're from. So in other words, Black people writing about Black communities or Black issues or Black characters, and not having white people write about Black main characters and Black culture. One of the reasons for this came out of the children's publishing community, when statistics showed that when there was a move to publish more people of color, more often than not, those books that were selected and acquired were by white authors rather than by people of color. So this has been a way to course correct for that. Now, aside from those serious issues I've just discussed, there is also a focus on things to help escape, escapist fun stories, positive stories, because we can't keep focusing on all the serious stuff 24/7. We need a release from that. So agents are also looking for those types of books. Last year, there was a lot of emphasis on things that were humorous, very, very funny, and like, I'm trying to think of the Netflix series that encapsulated this, but it's just disappeared out of my head. But certainly looking at things like Netflix and what's popular on the streaming services is a really good sign of what you can find agents and editors talking about. They often take their inspiration from what they're watching. pretty soundly, no one wants a dystopia right now, since we probably feel more like we're living in one and don't need to read about one. So now, if I were writing a dystopia, I probably would save that for submission until some other time. Some of the new imprints that we've seen launched this year, I'll divide them up into young adult, children's, so this would be all the children's books that are through, this would include chapter books, middle grade books, and picture books, and then adult nonfiction. In young adult, we've seen a new nonfiction imprint from Spruce Books, which is out of Sasquatch, and a new fiction YA imprint from one of the big 5 publishers called Underlined. Young adult has long been one of the growth areas for publishing, although the fiction has definitely slowed down in recent years and even become a little flat. So a lot of the growth right now in young adult and children's generally is on the nonfiction side, historicals, people and places, events, things of that nature. It seems like there's always a new children's imprint coming out from somewhere. Harper in particular has launched several new imprints this year, including Harper Chapters, which focuses on chapter books series, Quill Tree Books, and then Heart Drum, which focuses on Indigenous stories. And then in adult nonfiction, there's a couple new imprints out. I've now forgotten where Thread is from, but One Boat is a UK imprint that is focused on books about the environment and climate change and reckoning with that. So I've already brought up the diversity and representation issue as far as the author side, but there's also many calls inside and outside of the industry for better diversity and representation in the people who work up and down the supply chain of publishing. Not just authors, but also the literary agents, the editorial staff, the marketing and publicity, the executives, the sales team, and the reviewers. So, you know, it does no good to have more Black authors or people of color if the people inside the publishing house don't know how to market and sell them properly. So there's a huge tidal wave of change happening now, where you're seeing executives switch out, and you're seeing new faces come in, and hopefully people that will be able to do justice to titles that aren't, you know, do justice to titles that are from people of color, and won't have some of these knee-jerk reactions that Black authors have heard over many years, which is, oh, we already have one Black book this season, we don't have room for another, which that of course has to stop. Pamela says, I'm new to writing and publishing. What is an imprint? So an imprint, you can think about it in terms of a small publisher working within a publishing house. So I'll go back to this slide for just a moment. Oops, here we go. So when you look at a big publisher like Penguin Random House, they have dozens and dozens of imprints at that publishing house. And each one of them is usually led by an editorial director or a publisher who is has some sort of mission or something that they're trying to achieve through that imprint. An imprint might publish dozens of titles. They might only publish 6, 8, or 10, but they have a list that is supposed to cohere in some way and is looking for very specific things. So just knowing that, just saying that this book was published by Penguin Random House doesn't actually tell you much about the publisher. You need to kind of drill down to the imprint to see, you know, what is the personality of that imprint, because every imprint does have a personality of some kind. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about book marketing and promotion, which of course has dramatically changed as people are no longer able to do some of those traditional types of bookstore and library events that they used to. We're seeing, of course, this is getting very meta now since we're doing a virtual event right now, but authors are now engaging much more in things like Zoom book readings, Zoom book events, doing webinars, using social streaming services like StreamYard or Crowdcast in order to reach readers, sometimes reach even more readers than before because of accessibility issues. It's easier for us to go to a book event anywhere in the country from our homes. So some bookstores and libraries are making the best of this and having very full-featured, vigorous programs that still put on a really high-quality event that has led to book sales. So I'm not actually too concerned about, at least so far, about the lack of in-store events or library events, because those who are doing the virtual events well are still seeing similar, if not better, effects for their business and community. That said, there are people who are attempting to do some of those more traditional in-person events, social distancing events. One author so far from one of the big 5 publishers, Ellen Hilderbrand, she just had a New York Times bestseller. She did a very limited author tour. I believe this was on the East Coast of maybe 3 or 4 stores. And of course, when you do these types of events now, it comes with a lot of pre-planning, ticketing, windowing people to come in, only at specific times. A lot of precautions have to be taken. So, it all rests on finding the right venue or store who has some safety protocols in place and knows how to manage it well. I do know of one author, Ed, who you see pictured here. He lives in Western Kentucky. He wrote at my site recently about having his own socially distanced book event that he planned by himself. And he did it in partnership with a coffee shop. And he set up his table and his books outside the coffee shop. And if you go and read his post, he talks about specifically what went right and what went wrong. So it's very helpful for any of you who are thinking about trying to attempt this in the near future or even over the next 6 months. As important as ever during this time, it's so helpful if you're trying to do any sort of marketing and promotion, whether it's event-based or not, to be partnering with those in the community, with bookstores, with libraries, with other authors in order to improve engagement and turnout. Hopefully your publisher is doing something, if you do have a publisher, to help with that collaboration. All authors, including publishers, are leaning much more into social than they ever did to build trust and to engage readers, to do some of those foundational platform building practices, to have a better email newsletter list, to have better website navigation, to have better discounts and promotions that will reach people reliably. So if I had anything to share as far as marketing and promotion, what you should be doing over the next 3 to 6 months, it would be to focus on those long-term investments of your website and email newsletter, because that has the potential to pay off no matter what happens in the future. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and allow some time for questions and conversation. I know I went through a lot of statistics, touched on a lot of different areas of what's happening, what's been happening in 2020. But of course, there are other things that I skipped right over. So I welcome questions about traditional publishing, self-publishing. I know Cliff had a pretty sophisticated question about small press distribution, which I welcomed. So I take both the simple beginner questions and also the advanced. Anybody? Here we go. Jesse asks, is there any change in the horizon in audiobook rights? So for those who don't know, book publishers, at least the major traditional publishers and most small publishers at this point, they are going to retain with your contract print book rights, ebook rights, and now audiobook rights. So I don't expect any change in that because it's become such a critical format for publishers. The big 5 more or less have this nailed down, and like all books go to audio, most books go to audio right from the start and are part of the release. Other publishers, if they don't have that process nailed down yet, they will actively sell those rights to Audible or to someplace like Tantor very quickly after the book goes on sale. That's what happened to me with my book with University of Chicago Press, The Business of Being a Writer. The audio rights got sold not so long after the book released, and then the audio edition came out 1 year after the print and the ebook. So you do get paid for those rights. It's not like you're not profiting off of it, but it's really hard to retain them at this point with any sort of traditional book publishing deal. Probably the best thing you could do is ask for a contract clause that says that if the publisher doesn't exercise those audiobook rights in 2 years, then those rights revert to you, the author. That's probably the best you could hope for. Rosaline asks, what's important on an author's website? And I do have at my own website at janefriedman.com, I have basically what amounts to a checklist that you can go down and make sure that you have all of the most important components. But by far, like, I'd say the 3 things you've really got to focus on are, first, having a dedicated page for each and every book that you publish. The second would be a really solid author bio or about the author page, because that gets used by media and reviewers again and again and again. And then you want a contact form or a contact page, something that clearly makes it a clear and obvious way to contact you. I like forms because they can be easier to use. You can also just list your email address, but make it clear how you wish to be contacted. Now, there are a lot of questions about what to do with your homepage or how that should be designed or structured. I think most authors try to cram too much onto that homepage. Usually, if you're published already, you want to have your latest book and you want to have buy links to the major retailers and then a short blurb about the book. If you happen to blog, that's great. You can list some of the recent blog posts, but you don't have to blog, and most authors don't blog. So those are the key areas. And I think the big thing that authors will leave out that they should always include are those buy links. It's even better if you can make it a button. So on the homepage, as I mentioned, those buy links or buttons next to your latest title. And then on each dedicated book page for each book you publish, make sure that you link to all the formats at all of the major retailers. And that would include Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop Now, and then any place else that you think is going to be important. Books A Million, you could link to IndieBound, you could link to Kobo for your ebook or Apple Books for your ebook. It doesn't hurt to be exhaustive. Megan asks, what would I recommend to someone just starting out in publishing? Is it better to self-publish or to go with a publisher, ebook or paperback? If you're just starting out, I usually suggest people give traditional publishing a shot, look for an agent, or look for small publishers that don't require agents. Although I will say a lot here depends on your genre or your category. So self-publishing, where people have the most success, is usually with genre fiction. So like if you're writing romance, erotica, if you're writing science fiction and fantasy, mystery, crime, and thriller, these genres are where you see a lot of the self-publishing author success. So if you're writing a series, you want to do like a 10-book science fiction fantasy series, that to me speaks to a viable self-publishing path if you want to undertake that. However, if you're writing something that's book club fiction, literary fiction, poetry, short stories, essays, memoir, I find it really hard to go down the self-publishing path for those types of works. They need often reviewer support, media support, often bookstore support, library support, which is very hard to obtain as a self-published author. Self-published authors, their business model is mainly selling ebooks through Amazon. So the more that your book would benefit from having merchandising or being in book clubs or being talked about by reviewers, the more I would lean toward finding an agent or a traditional publisher. As far as paperback or ebook, I mean, you want as many formats as possible or that makes sense for the book. So almost all books at this point need to have both a print and an ebook edition, and also now, of course, audio. So I wouldn't make it an either or. You want as many formats as you can afford if you're self-publishing, or that the publisher, they're going to be able to make the right choice for you. A writer's asking about how agents might be getting many more queries right now, and would I recommend querying at this time or holding submissions until later? I don't think it makes any sense to wait, because you don't know what you're waiting for. Who knows what's going to happen? The future is a huge question mark. I don't think the situation will necessarily improve. It could get worse. You just don't know. So my advice is to submit when you feel the work is ready and see what happens. Mark asks, what's my opinion of publishing a novel with a university press versus a large commercial publisher? What are the pros and the cons? So usually a big commercial press they're going to be much more focused on bookstore placement, on mainstream media and reviews. Sometimes they have more marketing muscle or publicity muscle, but not always. Sometimes they neglect their books, so you have to be aware of that. There's never a guarantee they're going to do what they're capable of doing. But that said, they tend to have really strong, good reach into specialty outlets and all sorts of outlets where your book is appropriate, everywhere from Lowe's to Target to Walmart to the small boutique shops to Anthropologie. University presses tend to be a little more narrow in what they focus on, especially if they're focused on libraries or the classroom, appealing to professors. If that's their focus, they might not be doing much in the way of that specialty retail I mentioned. They might not be paying for merchandising. They may be much more narrow in their approach. That said, there are some university presses that do a great job bringing titles to market that have mass appeal and that do hit the New York Times list. So, every publisher is different. Every university publisher is different. There are some that are probably not well equipped to go big with a book, while others can in fact go big, like Harvard University Press, for example, or University of Chicago Press, which did my book. They weren't doing a general audience marketing campaign, but they do really well with editing and publishing titles because that's what they're known for, given the Chicago Manual of Style. So you always have to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of each publisher. We've got a question here from John, which, thank you, John. I should have addressed this earlier. Who are the big five publishers? So when I talk about the big five publishers, I'm talking about the big New York houses that you've probably heard of. They include Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, and Hachette. So those are the big five, and most of them also have counterparts in the UK, France, Germany. So these aren't just US publishers. In fact, they're owned, all but one is owned outside of the United States, and they have worldwide reach. That's another reason, actually, to go back to Mark's question. That's one reason that you might want one of these big five publishers, is that they have this potential to have a more worldwide sort of presence or release. They might be dealing more with subright sales, maybe. Certainly at University of Chicago Press, which again, I know because I publish with them, they have rights booths or rights presence at London Book Fair. I don't know if they go to Frankfurt, but so, it's just, again, every publisher is different. It's hard to say this is exactly what's going to happen with you if you choose a university press. Shanna asks, do I see self-publishing as becoming more acknowledged and appreciated, as in even being reviewed by major presses or winning contests that have typically been only open to traditionally published books? I don't know that it's more appreciated and acknowledged than it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, but certainly there's more acceptance that this is a viable way to earn a living and to publish as an author. But I don't see mainstream media outlets or mainstream reviewers suddenly becoming more open to reviewing or accepting them from awards. And a part of the issue is volume. There are more than 1 million titles self-published every year, 1 million. And that's not even counting like the stuff that doesn't get ISBN numbers. So we're just talking about the books we can count. Many authors self-publish without getting an ISBN number. So one of the reasons that you see reviewers and mainstream outlets not like drawing the line at self-published titles is because they already have, tens of thousands of traditionally published books they have to filter through. They don't want to add another million on top of that. So this isn't to say that attitude is necessarily right, but they're just trying to stem the tide. It's really, and it is in fact this huge I don't know the word I'm looking for, a tidal wave, I guess, of titles that are just come year after year after year. So if you are a self-published author who wants that mainstream attention or validation, you just have to start acting like a small publisher rather than a self-publisher. And it may be a little bit of issue of semantics, but there's certainly things you can do to make, basically start what amounts to a small publisher and approach the business as a small publisher. But I don't think that actually benefits most authors. I think you're better off, in fact, focusing on getting to readers directly and pushing aside some of the gatekeeper stuff that's more prevalent and traditional, where you're trying to get the attention of the gatekeepers, the people at the review outlets and the magazines and the book clubs. To me, it's a hard game to play unless you've got those relationships in place, as a traditional publisher does. Sarah asks, when I talk about dystopia, does that include science fiction or speculative fiction? Is it all lumped together? So yes, when I talk about dystopia, I'm talking about dystopia regardless of the genre that you might be working in. It could be young adult dystopia, it could be a dystopian thriller, it could be a dystopian fantasy, anything that could be described as a dystopia. Cheryl asks, how might I market a new poetry book tied to traumatic events like 9/11 and the eruption of Mount St. Helens, as well as ecology? That's a super specific question. And unfortunately, the answer depends entirely on your own strengths and assets, what you have in hand today. So marketing is super individual. It's hard to give someone a marketing plan that's going to work without knowing, like, do you have a website in place? What sort of publications have you already written for? What media outlets are you connected to? What part of the country are you in? Who blurbed your book, or who could you get to blurb your book? So there are all sorts of considerations that come into this. So there isn't like one way to market this sort of book that isn't connected to who you are and what your career has been like. For those who are interested, I am, just to give a quick marketing or a quick push for a class I'm doing later this year. I'm doing a webinar on effective book marketing and promotion. It's $25. You can sign up at my site at janefriedman.com. And I'm going to try and offer a way to think about book marketing and promotion, regardless of whether you're traditionally published, self-published, if it's a poetry book, if it's a novel. I'm trying to make you push you to evaluate what you have in hand, rather than look at what other people are doing and using that as a starting point. Ruth says, I've heard that personal essay publication, like in Modern Love in the New York Times, has led to book deals. How does a writer know where to send such work? Well, any place that has high visibility and circulation is the place to go. So, Modern Love, New York Times column, so many people see that. And obviously agents and editors, many of them are in New York and by default pay attention. But, there are also major literary journals that they're looking at: Paris Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Tin House when it was being published, but it's not anymore. So there are these publications that are just known for publishing emerging, up and coming writers. There's a really good list by Cliff, who I think is on this session, who he rounds up like the top 50 literary journals based on, or maybe 100 even, based on awards and mentions and other factors. So go take a look at Cliff's list, and that will give you a starting point on the literary journal side. On the online side, just think about the usual suspects like Huffington Post, Salon, Slate, The Atlantic, The New Yorker. So the places that you've heard of are the places that agents and editors are looking. Jessica has a pre-publishing question. Has agent querying protocol changed with COVID? She knows it's important to check the agency's site, to check their social media, to ensure they're not closed. But are there other shifts to consider now? Is summer less of a quiet time this year? Is it more of a decent time to query? I don't think protocol has changed. It only, it makes it just more important to look at the agent's guidelines, their site, their social, to test, to feel out their mood or see what's happening and see if they're actually considering material. Hopefully, agents and editors are being very forthright and transparent on their site, on social media, about what they want to see and if they're closed. And if they're not in the right frame of mind to consider materials, let's hope that they're closing. So I would follow their lead in terms of whether or not you're going to submit. In absence of any indication whatsoever, I would proceed more or less as you normally would, because there is absolutely zero way to second guess what's a good time. And as I've said, it could be a worse time in 2 months. So you can't predict what will happen. Therefore, submit when you're ready, and just avoid running afoul of their submission guidelines. Stacy says her agent says publishers are slow to respond to submissions right now. Do you think publishers are buying less? I don't think they're buying less, at least not yet. In the sales information I shared earlier, print sales are up. So if they were basing acquisitions on performance of the industry, my guess is that they would be acquiring more. But obviously there are a lot of stresses, and there are other parts of this picture that we're not talking about, like returns. But they're acquiring so far out, like they're acquiring for fall 2021, maybe even for spring 2022. So they can't just sit and wait to see what happens to make those acquisitions. They have to be acquiring now. So they might be slower to make decisions, maybe, but I don't think, it may have to do with work from home protocols. It may have to do with other shifts that maybe we don't know about. But I don't think it's a reason to hold off on submitting just because the publisher is slower to respond. I don't think it's a reluctance to buy. I think uncertainty just leads to maybe slower decision-making, maybe more cautious decision-making, but they still have to acquire. So that's the truth. John asks if there's a good checklist of the steps between writing and traditional publishing for a first-time author, like get an editor, write a query, get an agent. I haven't necessarily seen a checklist like that, but for most writers, what I suggest is first produce the best manuscript you can if you're writing a novel, if you're writing a memoir. I don't think that requires getting an editor unless you know there's a problem that has to be fixed and you can't fix it yourself. So I know many people hire professional editors thinking that it's going to give them an edge or an advantage, and I'm sorry to say that sometimes editors can do more damage than good. That's not to say you shouldn't hire one, but people often hire the wrong editor for the job. Like they hire a proofreader when they really need a content editor, or they're hiring someone who doesn't have experience in their genre because this is the cheapest person they could get or the soonest available editor at the firm. So there are lots of ways that people end up with a poor editor that really has no effect on the manuscript's chances with an agent. I do have a blog post at my site about finding and hiring the right editor for you. You can find it, I think, on the drop-down menu from the blog, and you can also just find it by Googling. So make sure you know why you're hiring the editor before you make that investment. And so after the manuscript is the best that you can make it, the next step is either finding an agent or submitting directly to publishers. And I do have a cornerstone post at my site about how to get a book published that, to the extent it's a checklist, it will tell you what are the considerations in deciding how to research the market, how to write the query, and then you go from there. So here's a question about how did the US publishing industry react to a novel written in English with an international setting? So I think this might be, how would the US publishing industry react to a novel written in English with an international setting? Oh, no problem. I mean, books can be set anywhere. Thrillers are often set in multiple locations around the world. So I don't think setting contributes to whether they're going to accept or reject. They're looking at the story premise, not the setting. And then we have Kara asking if it's possible to get a memoir published traditionally if you don't have a platform. She's writing her memoir and wonders if she should be dividing her time between standalone essays. Should she try to publish them in good publications so that by the time she's ready to query, she has more visibility? For anyone writing creative nonfiction, and memoir is part of that category, I always encourage, if possible, some small steps before the book comes out, some small publication wins. So that could be personal essays, it could be articles, it could be something else. But it's really hard to go from 0 to 100 with creative nonfiction, in my opinion, to go from I've published no creative nonfiction to I want to publish a book of creative nonfiction. Certainly it's common with novels, you know, to have a debut novel and you haven't done any short stories. But I find that it's less likely with memoir that you will have never published a single thing up until the memoir comes out. So yes, the short answer is yes. I encourage you to think about what pieces of this book could you possibly place that's not going to damage your ability to sell the book, having some of the material already out there. So definitely go down that path, assuming you have the time and the energy to do so. But the other piece of this question that you're asking about the platform, you know, memoirs do get sold on the basis of two qualities. The writing itself, like the quality of the storytelling, it's how it behaves as literature, just like how a novel is sold. And then they also get sold based on the currency or relevancy of the story, how unique or compelling it might be in the current marketplace. So we have to feel like there's some resonance to the story, or there's something fresh or interesting about it, something we haven't seen before. So agents tend to get pitched memoir on the same sort of themes and issues that make it harder for those memoirs to get accepted. That includes topics like addiction, grief, like loss of a child, a parent, a spouse, beating cancer. So like there are these universal things that people are called to write about that make it harder to publish a book on because so much has already been said. So how are you going to say it differently, or how are you going to say it in a way that really captures people's attention? So as far as building platform, I don't know that it can be done for a memoir outside of you have a publishing track record, you're engaging on the themes and issues involved in your memoir, perhaps with organizations or on social. But it's really hard for me to encourage people building a platform before the book comes out for a memoir, because it can feel like spinning your wheels. Releasing the book is often the biggest way to build your platform. So it is something of a catch-22, unfortunately. All right, so Deborah asks if it's normal to pitch multiple agents at one time, or do you await acceptance or rejection before moving on? It's definitely normal to query many agents at once. You could query 6 at once, 20 at once, 100 at once. But I usually recommend dividing it up into a few rounds so that if you notice that maybe there's a problem, like you keep getting the same response where people misunderstand what you're pitching, you have an opportunity to correct that and send out another wave of submissions. So yes, I would not wait. I would not do it one at a time and wait, because you would be here till the end of your life waiting on some of these people to respond. Sometimes they don't respond at all. It's just rejection through silence. So that's the unfortunate truth. So I think that's actually the last question. So I'll wrap it up now. I know that the program is going to be moving on to another speaker and topic here shortly. Thanks so much to 1455 for having me. And I look forward to seeing some of you in the future. And I did see some familiar faces, so thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Jane. Really, really appreciate all your time. And thanks everyone for your great questions. I do want to make a note specifically to Kara, who asked us a question about memoir. We will be covering that in an upcoming session at 4 o'clock today. It's in track 2, and the title of it is Tell My Story, Preserving the Memory of a Family Member. So just as an FYI, if that's a genre you're interested in, please definitely plan to join us. That is it for this session. Our next session comes up at 1 o'clock, so just a few minutes away. And it is a meditation and creativity workshop that's being led by Zia Wellesley. So I'm going to drop off here while I queue everything up, and then we'll pop back on promptly at 1 o'clock and get started. Thanks so much, all.